But I think change management, you're right, is absolutely hard. It's a whole nother podcast. We've both been at places to where it's just like you're trying to introduce all the things at once, right? There's new features. There's also all this other like stuff that impacts developer experience and ergonomics, and it can really weigh like on developers. And so whenever I add something or do something, I'm not interested in doing that at all.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And this was something that I learned at Stored because I thought I was pretty good at change management until I went to Stored and I was changing stuff. And we consistently got feedback from engineers that the front end was changing too much. And I was like, we're changing it slowly, but you have to. The thing that I don't think I learned, or that it took me a minute to learn, was that like slow is relevant relative to the pace at which an engineer interacts with that code base. If they only interact once a month and you only change something once a month, it still feels like something is new every time they interact with it. And like, so that was the thing that I learned from that, as sort of that, like how fast change is relative to how frequently the engineers that are like experiencing that change interact with what you're changing.
Yeah.
But you're right. But that does kind of tie into what I wanted to talk about today. We're just going to dive right in. Is that all right?
Yeah, you sent me this article and I started to read it, and I mean it clicks so many boxes.
Yeah, I mean it's not, what's great about it is that it's not stuff that we haven't talked about on the podcast before. Just as a sort of brief well, I think like, and I think you're very much in this space now too, but also just your headspace is there. Like the mindset is around developer productivity. My official title is developer productivity engineer. A year ago that field kind of didn't exist, maybe in like August of 2021. I don't know what year is it, 2021. Atlassian and several other large consulting organizations started writing about this idea of developer productivity engineering. And that is like essentially not platform. It's not platform folks. It's not folks that are building the platform. It's just focusing on the problems that engineers face in order to be productive. And at the time, there was a framework called Dora that was mostly focused on delivery and stability. And that was what you measured productivity on, is developed. And then there became this other one called Space. And now we have a new article. That's the one you're referring to. Okay, so there's this new framework now, and it has three states. It has feedback loops, flow state, and the mental overhead, which is tied to change management, which we're talking about, but it also ties to a bunch of other things we've talked about, like just coding practices in general. How hard is it to stand up a code base? Like how clean is your code? Like all of that is kind of the mental overhead of a code. And then of course we've talked a ton about feedback loops. I think we just did a whole podcast on that. So the last one there is of course flow states, which we literally just did a podcast on, which is kind of exciting. So this is definitely stuff we've been talking about. You said you've been reading the article. Any immediate thoughts?
Yeah. The first one jumps to mind, and this is just kind of like applies to a lot of things, right? It's like another day, another framework. Um, so when I see this, because it's constantly evolving. You do things one way, and then we identify that there's issues with it, and then we do things another way. And sometimes we recycle the past. It reminds me, and not specific to this, but reminds me of like how clothing and fashion goes. We wear tight jeans, then we don't wear tight jeans, and then we
Yeah.
come back around and we wear tight jeans, but they're a little bit different. These are different ones. And so when I was reading the article, a lot of stuff is reminiscent of the past, kind of with like a new spin on it. But at the same time, I do like that there's an identification like in progress. Like this is happening. We aren't simply just saying we're gonna keep going on as we were.
Yeah, and I think like I just want to pause here and say that the comparison of software to like fast fashion is really intriguing to me. Um, because like that comes with like lots of like hard edges. Like that comparison was really, really pointed. And so I want to just acknowledge that there is probably a great piece of conversation for us to have there, but I don't want to tackle it today. So I'm just noting it because it was such a good call out that sometimes software does feel like fast fashion. Things are always changing. Everything old is new again. It's never finished. We talked a little bit about that last time, like knowing when something's done. And it's interesting because my boss's boss's boss even said that yesterday, like, you know, in some way, like developer productivity was never finished. And that's, you know, that's a little true. We were talking specifically about our roadmap. But anyways, like I think what's really like true here that you're calling out is like this is a pretty new field. And so it started with like consulting firms coming in and saying like, how productive are your engineers? That's important to measure, right? And then they were like, well, how we measure it needs to change. And now we've got another framework. And what I think is really interesting about this is kind of buried in the framework is that the importance of two kinds of metrics. And the first is like actual like measurement. You and I have lived in teams where commits are measured and PRs are measured, and like people are basically like there's a little bit of a competition where people are put against each other to see who's delivering better, faster, more, and all of that. And that has definitely been sort of the mindset of developer productivity, I think, for the last year and a half. But the thing that this thing calls out is that probably the more important, or at least as important piece of developer productivity is developer sentiment. Like you have to actually ask your engineer, how productive are you? How frequently are you able to get into a flow state? What is the mental overhead of working in our stack? How hard is it to get a good feedback loop? Because and I live this right now. We started this talk right before the call talking about Cypress, but something that has plagued me is that like the consistent feedback that we get when we do these surveys, developer productivity surveys, and we ask the teams, you know, what is the thing that is the most problematic to you? Over and over again, like we get the response Cypress testing. And like this is such an important thing because the metrics would tell us Cypress testing is not a problem. Our Cypress tests pass when they're supposed to pass and fail when they're supposed to fail. But if the engineering sentiment is that this is a problem, then it's still a problem.
Right. Yeah. It's absolutely it's true. A lot of it comes back to like skills gaps and change, right? Change management again. Not trying to get too deep there, but like as developers, we are constantly having to learn new things. Every problem has its own set of unique underlying problems and then potential solutions, and so that requires a lot of research. So we're constantly learning. And so when we have other stuff that we have to learn, maybe it's an engineer that's new to the organization and they have to learn Cypress, and not
Mm-hmm.
only like Cypress, but how you do Cypress,
Right.
because how
Right.
you do Cypress is different than how another company does Cypress, and company C does Cypress completely different. And that's true in a lot of ways. Um, in the last couple of companies that I've been at, they each did things quite a bit different.
Right.
So you're not only learning, so you come in and you're like, hey, I think I know this stuff, and I feel pretty confident in my abilities. And then you get here and you're like, holy crap, I have to learn all this other stuff because we do it differently here.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that's that's definitely something that needs to be taken into account. So if the folks are saying, hey, Cypress is a problem, right? The framework itself or the library itself, that's not necessarily a problem because it works. It provides value. We can see the value that it provides, but there's still something there.
Yeah.
Um, the first thing you called out was, and I think that this is really important, that like per the article and per other examples, is that a lot of times you identify stuff by bringing outside people in. Happens all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Big companies will pay for like outside analysts to come in and analyze how productive everybody is or things that need to change. And that's a really good like viewpoint, because when you're inside, when you're part of this day to day, you don't always see the bigger issues.
Yeah.
So when you bring somebody else in that doesn't have any biases, right? They don't have anything to base it on, like, hey, they've been here for a couple of years and this is the way we've always done things. That's a really good lens to look through. And that's where you can see the value in bringing somebody else from the outside in. So absolutely love that was called out in the article and in other aspects of life. And that can be hard for us to do when we're on teams and we say this all the time, like I think you mentioned it not too long ago, but the idea of that just because we've always done something this way doesn't mean that we should continue to do it this
Yeah.
way. But you can't always, you know, start to have the mindset shift unless you do some analysis, right? You do some of this. So absolutely. I think that the change here, that's pointing out to go from Dora to space to, whatever's next, right? The new thing. I think it's really important because the way that we work changes, the way that we learn changes. I mean, now you've got like a lot of folks leveraging like ChatGPT as part of your
Yeah.
work. You're leveraging GitHub Copilot and other things. So we also have to adapt, and change to the way that people's lives are changing at home.
Yeah, for sure. I love that you called out like I want to just spend a little bit of time on like the consultancy and agency aspect of this. Like probably in my less sensitive to like just how people change and grow in the days when I was like less sensitive to that, I would have called this like organizational myopia. And I mean, I this like specifically that's like what I called it when I was at USA. And that's when you're in a system for so long that everything feels normal. And so you have this sort of like when somebody is like, well, why does that like this is not a USA question, but at several of the organizations I've worked since then, you'll have a really talented front end engineer get hired into the organization and they'll be there for 2 or 3 weeks. And then they'll just come to me and be like, Randy, why are we doing TypeScript this way? And like, it's a great reminder that like when you come in from the outside, like you don't have that like, well, here's the whole system. And the reason that we're doing it this way is because like there's a journey that we're going on here and a story that we're telling. We've talked about stories. And that story that we're telling will one day be a different view of TypeScript, but right now it's this. But if you are in the system, like pipelines taking a really long time, or those sorts of things, or tests that are flaky. Like if you've been in an organization for like, I don't know, I was at USA for 5 years, and especially if you work in the same area for all of that time, that one test that fails over and over again just becomes a part of the routine. And so it takes an outsider, either new hires, early career engineers, consultants to come in and say, like, man, that one test that's failing is costing you 100 hours a year. That's, or whatever. I don't know the number, but like it takes an outsider to come in and say, like, no, that's not just a part of like the routine, the Rube Goldberg that you press this button and flip that switch to finally get your code into production. That's actually a problem. And I think that's called out in the amount of manual intervention required to get code to production. I don't think we tend to think about it that way. Rerunning a pipeline doesn't feel like doing something manually to get code to production, but absolutely it is. The amount of manual intervention to get code to production is a direct implication on developer productivity. And Dora was the first to call that out, and that was the conversation that came directly out of consultancies starting to look into this space.
Yeah. I know I've done it myself, gone to a place and been like, why are we doing it this way?
Yeah, but it's a great question to ask.
Yeah, and sometimes honestly what happens is you go to that next company and you're like, holy crap, y'all are doing it this way. That's awesome. I wish we were doing it that way at my last place. So I know I've mentioned this before, and like the market's kind of shaky, so it's not really a time that people want to like up and move. But let's say you had that confidence in your abilities, or you're getting an offer. Moving around is a really good thing. Like it really does. It allows you to compare things, right? So when these analysts are coming in or going from company to company, they're comparing, right? In their head, you don't know. I mean, you don't know what they saw at the last company that they went to this analysis at, or the previous companies. So it's the same thing with you going from place to place. Um, the employees, when you get there, the rest of the folks that are already working there, they don't know everything that you're taking with you or bringing with you from the other company. So first, that's really good. But like if we're going back to this framework, you talked about the 3 pillars.
Yeah.
You talked about feedback loops, flow state, and cognitive load, and how they all impact like this thing called developer experience.
Yeah, so like you have these 3 things, and of course these are things that like first two things that are really important here. You have the 3 things that you just mentioned, And what I think is really, really awesome is that like this is a space where you and I have been very focused for a while. Like y'all, for our listeners, like there's a whole bunch of episodes in our backlog that speak to many of these things. I mean, we just talked about flow state last week, and stuff. And the other thing is that there's a shift here that you acknowledged right there that we haven't actually talked about, and that's a shift from developer productivity to developer experience. And I think that's a really important shift to make, to talk about it less about, and it's a diminishment, right? Like we have to acknowledge it's a diminishment. It's a diminished focused on outputs. It really is, because we're not talking about productivity as much anymore. We are talking about productivity, but in addition to productivity, we're talking about experience. How is it like, because if I have an ecosystem where I'm super productive, I can be super productive, but I'm miserable the whole time, then I'm not going to be productive for very long. And I think what we're really getting at is that team productivity is probably like, I mean, you and we've talked about this on the podcast, that the fundamental unit of engineering is a team, not an engineer, but a team. And so when we think about that measure, like thinking about like developer experience and churn rates and starting to think about like a team sustainability, developer experience becomes very important. How easy is it to do these things, or how simple is it to do these things? Because those two, that's different, right? Is it simple or is it easy? Simple means low cognitive load. Easy means like I can press a button and it happens. And you kind of want to find the balance between those two. And so you have those three pillars. You have flow state, which is, I mean, every conversation we have ever had about meetings or interruptions. And I think we've both worked in an environment where you had a different kind of disruption to flow state. And that is the fire drills. And so it's important that an organization understands how to manage fire drills in such a way that they protect the ability to stay in a flow state. And not everybody is running everywhere all the time. Like it's a city under siege or whatever. Like the majority of your engineers need to be in a flow state the majority of the time. And that's because one, engineering is hard. And two, like we don't, like you've mentioned the whole 40 hours thing, like we can't do this versus like the ability to come in and do something and then 30 minutes later go to a meeting and come back to an hour later and pick up right where you left off. That's a myth. Like it takes, like we've got great studies on this. It takes you 25 minutes to ramp back up into a task. And so if you're like leaving every 30 minutes, you're getting like, you're not able to ramp up. So that's flow state, is like just, no meetings, but also reducing noise that might distract you from the ability to do your work.
Yeah.
And so then oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I thought you were pausing there. Uh, but I like that you called out like the shift from productivity to developer experience. And I really think that like having a solid developer experience actually facilitates good product productivity, right? So
Oh yeah.
like you
Yeah,
mentioned this,
absolutely.
when things are easy, you can get more done. So I always, I like to dumb things down or simplify things as simple as possible. If I need to change the color on this button, right? Or I need to change what this button does when you click it. If there's a lot of hoops for me to jump through to make that small change, right? That relatively small change, it might take me, 2 times or 3 times as long from the time that I start it because of all the unnecessary research that might, be required. Getting the feedback, let's say, our feedback loops aren't tight. So let's say that change is sitting there for a day before I get feedback. And then there's some feedback that comes in, maybe it's highly opinionated. And then, I make my changes. And then so 2, 3, 4 days later, plus QA testing just to change the color of a button.
Yeah.
Right. That's poor developer experience. And because of that, my productivity fails. And I also wanted to mention too, like, I don't care about productivity in the sense that, or in the way that productivity was really, thought of in the past. Like if you think of, and probably still today, if you think about like production line workers, right? They have a quota to meet, right?
Right.
And even
Right.
call center folks, and they live a rough life. Like anybody who thinks being on a phone call or being in a call center is easy because you get to sit in a nice air conditioned room, it's not, because of the
No.
the quotas and the demand. Like you can't have hardly any in between time or any downtime in between calls. And so they have this high like benchmark for productivity, this high standard that they have to meet. And to be able to do that, you like, people are like skipping restroom breaks and
Right.
they're cutting their lunches short, right? And then if they have to upsell, like this is almost like an unreachable productivity, and there's high churn
Yeah.
in this environment. And so you definitely don't want high churn, or I don't want high churn in the environment in which I can work. And so if I have an opportunity to help improve developer experience in any way, we were
Yeah.
talking about this a little bit before the call, right? Is that if I make it a change, I'm going to be very intentional not to introduce any extra noise or to make you have to think more about this change that you're making to where it actually, inadvertently or in a roundabout way impacts your productivity. But not saying that you have to go 100 miles an hour and you
Right.
have to stay consistent. But really, I just want you to maintain your flow state, and whatever your productivity is, that's what it is. And one last thing you mentioned, you mentioned like, I don't know, a couple minutes ago, you talked about like developers, they start to, or engineers, they start to like compete, right? Like who's doing more work? Hey, I know you've seen that.
Hmm.
I've seen that quite a bit too. And you'll have like engineers that they're constantly calling out, hey, I've got this PR. Hey, I've got 6 PRs out here. And they're like constantly like saying, like, hey, look at me, look at all this work I did.
Hmm.
And probably like in the beginning, in the beginning, like we're all out to like prove that we can do this job. And so
Right.
in the beginning, I was doing like hackathons. Oh, we got hacked. I'm signing up. I
Yeah.
did like every single hackathon for like my first 2 years. Um, but again, learned a lot. And then we need somebody else to do this other thing. Oh, okay, yeah, I could probably do that. And end up doing the thing right because I'm worried about my productivity,
Hmm.
right? People are gonna notice that I'm not doing
Your
as much as the next person.
your perceived productivity.
My perceived productivity, that's exactly right. And here I am, like years later. I don't give a hoot about productivity. I'm probably like the lowest producing engineer on like one of the any of the last companies that I've been at, and it's because I care more about like my mental health. I care more about like the developer experience. I don't care that I'm churning out crap, and
Yeah.
and all the work's not crap.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's probably the wrong term, but I don't care that I churn out a lot. I want to churn out quality.
Yeah, I think that's the internal focus there is really important. Is like a shift in what I think about how I want to perceive my own delivery. Like I don't necessarily want to perceive my own delivery as delivering a lot of change, but as delivering a lot of value. And sometimes that means less change because that relationship between change management and value, that we have to have that conversation. We're not going to have it today. You can tell that we're kind of dancing around it because it's so intrinsic to this conversation. I think one of the things that you called out that really is important is like the relationship between flow states and feedback, because like even good feedback at the wrong time can break flow states. And the other thing is like I love your example of like changing the color on a button, right? And so you change the color on a button, and if the feedback cycle is long for any variety of reasons, say your pipeline is just slow and flaky or whatever, like you what I think you do is like, so there's two things in any engineering organization. You have the inherent risk. That's the risk that's tied to your organization or your business domain or the like domain that you're working in. Like if you're an auth, there's a lot of inherent risk, right? If you're working in banking, where we both have, there's a lot of inherent risk. If you're working in medical records, which we both now do, there's a lot of inherent risk. So there's inherent risk in the work that we do. And then there's induced risk. And that's the risk that basically like you put on yourself. That's like the fake stress. And what I think about is like we talked a little bit about this last time, but okay, so you change the color on a button. That's like a one-line code change. Say that your code is really good, and it's a one-line code change. You change that one place, and the button color changes like it's supposed to. But then your pipeline is 3 hours. Well, you're probably not. You're like, well, I took 5 minutes to do this. I can probably do a whole bunch of other stuff in 5 more minutes, and 5 more minutes, and 5 more minutes, and then the cost of that pipeline and babysitting that pipeline are worth it. But it's not worth it to sit and wait for 3 hours for a 5 minute change. So then you induce risk by growing the size of your change set, by increasing the amount that changes all at once. That's the whole change management part. And that increases the risk, but all in favor of a developer having a better experience because they don't want to make a small change and then wait forever to ship. Like, and I think we've lived this, both of us, with pipelines. Like, the longer a pipeline is, the more you want to put into it, because like it's otherwise you got to run that pipeline, for all those little changes. And so like I think about feedback from people, but also feedback from your pipeline. Oh, this test failed. We talked about Cypress. Like, Cypress is, any end-to-end test is prone to flakiness. And so like if it fails and now you've got to rerun everything because that failed, or rerun that step because that failed. Well, like if that has to happen a lot, like that's feedback. And that's not necessarily the feedback that we want to give, or the way that we want to give it, that facilitates good developer experience, because we want to shift that feedback left. And if it's successful early, we want it to be successful later.
Yeah. And that whole, when things are flaky, when there's things outside the scope of the change are introduced, then again, that's context switching, right? Now I have to go
Yeah.
worry about this other thing, as opposed to worrying about the thing that is really important, which is the change that I've been assigned or that I picked up.
Yeah.
And like, you cannot stress like developer. Like, I'm glad that you have the role that you have, and I'm glad that it is a role that exists now, right? Developer productivity.
Yeah.
Um, and it's really important to say it's not that your job is to make people more productive in the in the like the original sense, right? Basically, it's not your job to say, hey, you've got to do more tickets per week. I'm going
Right.
to facilitate you doing more tickets per week or whatever. It's like removing the noise, removing the stuff, right? Actually solving the reason for the flaky test, right? And a lot of times it just has to do with data and environments.
Yeah.
And if that's an issue, I mean, come on, like, we should fix that. And that's where like the incremental change comes in. Again, change management is the whole thing that we'll probably be knocking on the door at. But like feedback loops too. Um, as part of this, as part of one of the pillars of this framework, like the feedback loops need to be really tight, because it takes, and this goes back to like getting into flow state. You said it takes about 25 minutes to get into flow state. Sometimes it takes me longer.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I will sit and stare at the screen and try to get into this rhythm, and I just can't do it. Like, focus is hard. So that's the other thing too, right? You can't always get into a flow state. It just there's days where there's no flow state for me today. I'm basically going to do nothing. I
Yeah.
might do a little research, but I'm not going to be super productive in ways that are important to me. And because of that, when I am productive, I need fast feedback loops. Like, I need, you know,
Yeah.
prompt response, um, because we have to take advantage, right? It's kind of going back to what I talked about last week or the week before. It's like, I'm going to give you my best when I'm at my best.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not at my best 5 days a week. I'm not at my
Yeah.
best 40 hours a week. I'm probably at my best like 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, or 2 hours a day, maybe 3 hours a week, because that's just the way it is, right? Like, you have to get into this flow state. You have to engage all of you without any distractions. And there's lots of distractions, right? Sometimes it's meetings. Oh crap, there's a meeting coming up in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Because it's coming up in 30 minutes. It's already broken your flow state. Like, even
Yep.
if it's 30 minutes from now, you already know it's coming. You're already done. So it's like,
especially
yeah,
especially if you know that, like, I mean, coming back to pipelines, if your pipeline takes more than 30 minutes and you have 30 minutes to your next meeting, like,
you're
what's
done.
what's even the point? Yeah.
Yeah. And then, like, even if like, so first of all, if your pipeline takes 30 minutes, like, that's just too long. Like,
Yeah.
like, what are we running in the pipeline? Are we like, or is there like an order going out for like lunch in the pipeline? Or is there like, are we checking like, all the words in the dictionary? Like, we're like, what are we even doing at that point, right? And so we have to really like evaluate what's important.
Yeah.
And it comes back to just that, like, what's really important. The fact that we're not saving babies, the fact that um, you know, doing this is taxing on us, right? So ultimately, we need support from everybody. And one of the ways that I like to do it is, you can kind of like get a sense of how everybody's doing, like on stand up,
Hmm.
or just throughout the day, or at the beginning of the week or at the end of the week. You can get a sense, right? You can like read the room.
Yeah.
Just, it's different virtually, but when you're in person, you can read the room, and you have to be aware, first of all. Like some people aren't even aware, but if you're aware of it, you can read the room, see where people are at, like mentally. You kind of sense it. And when somebody's been working on something for a while, I want to call this out first too, right? One of the biggest anxieties anybody can face is you're going to stand up and you have to give your, status.
Hmm.
And here you are, like on day 3 or 4 or 5 or week 2 of this ticket that you've been working on, and you're like, struggling with it because maybe there's a lot of research going on. Maybe it's bigger than you thought it was. Maybe it's more complex. You run into this issue, you solve one issue and then you get to the next one, and here you are, right? And you get to stand up, and the anxiety that gets, it might be self-induced, right?
Hmm.
But you
But it's real.
know it's real, and you know that the team is gonna, the team's gonna be like, ah, this person's still working on this ticket from 2 weeks ago. Like, what's going on? But this happens all the time,
Hmm.
and we go into these meetings and you feel it, and it's like, you just want to get your status out over with. Sometimes people will like, hey, I can't make stand up, but here's my status.
Yeah.
And like, we have to acknowledge that, right? This is part of all this kind of that we're talking to, maybe in a roundabout way, but. And so sometimes what I'll do, now that I've kind of set this up, sometimes what I'll do is I'll say, hey, you're working on this thing. Can I help? Can we just mob program on it?
Yeah.
Let's work on it together. And what that does is that like shows support for someone else. Um, and sometimes, like, just being completely honest, sometimes they haven't done any work on it.
Yeah.
And it's not because they're incapable. Maybe they're having trouble getting into a flow state,
Right.
right?
Right.
Maybe they're having trouble. Maybe they're so frustrated at the developer environment. Like, you could talked about this before. Start here was sometimes a developer won't, or an engineer won't touch, a repo or a code base or a section of the code for a long time, and then you come
Hmm.
back and all these things have changed. Oh crap, now I gotta learn all this stuff, right? So what
Yeah.
happens is, right, this frustration set in, and you're just like pushing it off and pushing it off and pushing it off, and we've all been there, to
Yeah.
where we don't even want to look at this. I just want to put the ticket back.
Right.
I,
Right. But you
and
don't. I mean, like exactly that. Like you want to put the ticket back. Like, and I think there's a level like where like you feel more comfortable to do that. Like just, oh, I'm not going to do that ticket right now. But I think when like, especially like early career or mid career, like I know this with folks that I'm working with right now, and like they're like, well, can I just like do I need to finish this ticket first? And I'm like, no. Like if you just put it back, like just whatever, like we know that it needs to be done, it can be done later. Like you found something that's a smaller win, and so take that win.
you know one of the things that's in this space, is like how we operate as teams. And I am a huge fan, and it is, I don't even have to use this term, but I'll use the term so people can kind of understand what I'm talking about. Is I I enjoy like Kanban as opposed to, or if you pronounce
Hmm.
it Kanban, it's whatever you want. I pronounce it Kanban. I prefer Kanban over Scrum.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is, and again, I know organizations practice stuff differently, so just apply it to yourself. Is I don't like knowing that every 2 weeks, right? Or I have this velocity that we're trying to meet. Because that's the thing too. We're trying to meet velocity. It's just a fancy term for productivity, right? Our quota,
Right.
um, these every 2 weeks, and you get there and you're like, man, I know I didn't meet it, or I'm like, whatever. I only worked one ticket. And when you work Kanban, it's just like, you pick up a ticket, you put back a ticket, you finish the ticket, you work 2 or 3 tickets in parallel, right? If you want to do
Yeah.
that. But it's very much just like piecework kind of stuff. You pick it up and you do it. Um, I prefer that because I feel like there's less pressure, even if it's just like self-induced, because again, that is a huge part of it. And that is real. Even though it's self-induced stress, it's absolutely real. And we feel that we're always trying to make sure that we as individuals feel productive. And I think, like leadership, one of the things that leadership can always do is to help, like, set people at ease, is by facilitating some of this, you know um like getting things done. Like, ultimately stuff still has to get done.
Yeah.
Like you're getting paid to get stuff done, and what leadership can do is help people get stuff done, not by simply saying, hey, this needs to get done, where are you at, we this needs to be done. Now, the way I like to facilitate it is like going back to what I told you. Hey, let's knock it out together. I mean,
Yeah.
there's lots of benefits that come from this, is, and it's part of the developer experience too. Is um, maybe I'm more familiar with this section of the code base, and I can kind of help walk you through. So you're also learning. But I've also just reviewed the changes for you. Like right now, as we were working through this,
Yeah.
whether you're driving or I'm driving, maybe I'm giving feedback, we're both talking about the solution. Guess what? When you put that PR up or that merge request, I've already reviewed it, or we've reviewed it together. And
Yeah.
I'm validating it as soon as, maybe I have a preview environment, whatever. And I know the change, and we've talked about the impact together. But bottom line is that, like, for me, if I'm working with somebody, there's always a risk to what we're doing, right? Like, and the truth is, like, what I do, I am not like really saving babies. Like, that's not what I do. And I like not having that pressure. And so what
Yeah.
happens if we push something that breaks? Guess what? We're just going to revert it,
Yeah.
or we're
Exactly.
gonna or we're gonna fix it this time. Like, and I've worked at companies in the past to where, man, they were just so serious. Like, everything is so serious what we do, and it has to be this way. And I always, I come back to this. When you're no longer working at this company, or when you die of a heart attack because of all this stress, the only real way that people are going to know that you've been there is because of the commits in the code base. But eventually, those commits are going to be overridden.
Yeah.
Somebody's going to come behind you and make a change, and you, at some point in time, there's not going to be any evidence that you've ever been in that code base. All that stuff that you stressed over, nobody's going to know about it. And
Yeah.
then so you have to ask yourself, is this even really worth it? I know I went off on a tangent there, but I'm a huge, like, ultimately I just want to get stuff done, and then if it doesn't work, we'll do it again.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that I want to tack into here. I want to end by talking about like what leadership can do. You mentioned that, and I think there's some really great takeaways there. But like what I think is really great is that you kind of hit on that last pillar that we needed to spend a little bit of time on, and that's mental overhead. Because like what's important to note is that mental overhead isn't just I have to think about all of this conspicuous code. It's also everything I have to do that is not writing the code in order to put the code in production. Is that copious amounts of documentation? Is that story pointing and like scrum planning and ticket writing? Like all of that is overhead. And there's an acceptable level to that. I don't want to say we shouldn't do any of that. But like I think we should definitely be measuring those things and asking like what's the overhead? What's the organization, operational process overhead to moving a ticket to production? If and or is there repetition in there, right? Like, do I write a ticket? Like, and you called out Kanban over Scrum. I think like we're both on the same page there. Like, Propeller is a Kanban board, and there are no story points. Like, we make the bold assumption that every story is 1 point, and velocity isn't measured in points. It's just the number of tickets they close. And that's an exercise. But like, I think a lot about like I'm going to pick on story pointing here. You got to pick on Scrum. I'm a pretty big fan of not pointing stories, and I think the thing that makes me that should demonstrate that this is organizational overhead that's maybe juice that's not worth the squeeze is that how many times have you been in a Scrum training session on which one is bigger, the alligator or the elephant? Like or the apple or the watermelon. Like y'all, we all know that one is bigger than the other, but like I mean, what's the value there? And so like that's the thing that I think about when it comes to organizational overhead is you have to have some of it, but you should be asking like what's the sort of secondary value, and is it really manifesting itself? This is something that's really important, I think, when and kind of comes to the leadership, is like every requirement that we put is a bet that we are making on some change that has value. We absolutely have to check our bets. And that means that on some interval, we need to go back and say, did the value that I thought was going to be manifested from this documentation or from story pointing or this process, did the value that I thought was going to be manifested get manifested? Because if the answer is, and that's not something I think this is where the consultancy comes in. A lot of times we just do it because that's what's done. And the consultancy has to come in and say, hey, actually, you're just wasting a ton of time.
Yeah.
And because a lot of times you are. And we are. And so, but like that's the thing is as an organization, as an organizational leader, we have to check our bets. We have to say, this is the bet I'm making. We have to be very explicit. I'm doing Scrum because it yields this value. Maybe that value is a better handle on deadlines. We make our deadlines more frequently. Whatever, express that in a quantifiable way so that you can go back and say, did that happen? Did that happen? Like document the reason behind those decisions. There's this thing called architectural decision records, but this is probably true of process too. We just document the decision and the rationale so that you can come back and look back and say, well, did that play out the way that I thought it would? Because if not, it's probably not worth doing. And all of that's mental overhead. And I think the other thing that you've kind of called out, like right here is and this is probably the most key portion of this study that came out. Most important thing for leadership to do is survey their engineers on how they are feeling. That's it. Ask them. Like, if I would go so far as to say, if you're a leader, just ask every one of the engineers that report to you in any way, hey, if you had to like, I mean, and what's great about this is USA used to do this. Like, I don't know if you remember, but like you had this little smiley face, rate your job today. And you had 5 little colors that you could click. Like, and you could do that every day. The more frequently you're collecting that feedback. And so as leaders, we should just ask, hey, rate your job on a scale of 1 to 10, net promoter score, right? If it's a 8 to 10, cool, we're okay, probably. If it's a 6 or 7, I mean, that's danger zone. If it's a 5 or below, like, that's somebody that is is really struggling. So like, I think that's the other thing. And that's the really key part of this study is if you're not surveying, this is like a bolded quote in the article, but if you're not surveying your engineers on their productivity, you're behind the industry standard on this. And this is important because we've all been measuring productivity for a while. We're measuring pull requests and tickets. You mentioned velocity and cycle times. We are quantifying productivity in a lot of ways. And so it's really important to say that it's not that you need to measure productivity. It's that you need to survey your engineers on their productivity. You just ask them, hey, and this is kind of comes to like, what do I think of as the focus of developer productivity? Just asking them, hey, what's the biggest thing that's in your way right now? What's the biggest thing that makes this job more difficult than you feel it should be? That's the next problem for developer productivity to solve. And if you in an organization that doesn't have a developer productivity team or a developer productivity like focus, then it's definitely worth thinking about and doing that. Like, I'm not going to say it should be a team because every organization is different, and maybe you have somebody like yourself that is on a product team that's focused on that team's productivity, so they're building the tools for the team, but you need that support function. I think is really what it comes down to. You need that support function that is knocking obstacles out of the way. In a lot of ways, I think about this like, I don't know, Scrum Masters, right? Scrum Masters knock down process obstacles and get people talking across organizations, but they don't usually knock down technical obstacles. And so you need somebody that's able to knock down technical obstacles and just get it out of the way.
You know, with all this you said, right? A lot of times when I talk to you, I think about, man, I can see, Randy used to be a teacher, basically a scientist, right? And when I was teaching at USA, Steve was there and he would always talk in like, uh, like above me or over me sometimes in terms of like, hey, this is over my head kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that there's a lot of people like me that just like, I always like to say like I like to dumb things down, right? I'm gonna give it to you as simple as possible. And if we're talking about like business, because this comes back to business, right? Like we only have a job because there's a business.
Yeah.
Businesses want customers, right? And
Right.
usually happy customers will return. I mean, it's true. Like if I get a bad experience somewhere, I will probably not go and buy that product again, or I'll cancel my subscription. etc. Ultimately, I won't be a customer anymore.
Right.
So if I could like simplify this whole thing, right, for people like me, just again, I'm very that's how I like to get as down to the earth as I can. I would say you have, instead of measuring like how many velocity, how much tickets, um, if you make your, you know, if you make your engineers happy, if you make your product teams happy, they're going to deliver good work that ultimately makes your customers happy. And if you make
Yeah.
your customers happy, they'll come back. And that's what we should be measuring.